So I'm going to talk about the Bill and Peggy Stevenson's case that has recently come up in connection with the Delphi case. Bill and Peggy were 74 years old and they were killed in their home in Boone County, Kentucky. Bill operated a trucker chapel in Florence, Kentucky, and that was just a place where truckers could go to church while they were on the road and away from their own church, so they could go to a Sunday service and stuff. They had 2 sons and 1 daughter, and Bill was the oldest of 12 kids, so he had a very large and extended family. They were beloved in their community, and they were brutally murdered in their home. Detective Coy Cox went on the podcast Just the Tipsters to talk about this case, and I am going to take some of the stuff that he talked about on that podcast and just the things that I found interesting. The reason I found this stuff interesting is more because of rumors from the Delphi case earlier on, and also a lot of the stuff that the former prosecutor Robert Ives said. And this is all speculative. I don't know what the Delphi crime scene looked like, and I don't know what the Stephenson crime scene looked like either, but I think it's interesting that Detective Cox was so interested in Delphi, and so I would like to take a look at that case and see if we can maybe find any similarities of what possibly piqued his interest in Delphi.
It's possible to think of a motivation for the crime. In this case, the 2 girls were murdered. And as I've told people, the crime scene is very unusual. It's all very strange.
There's some unique physical aspects to the scene.
If you had arrived at this crime scene where the girls' bodies were found, there were 3 or 4 physical characteristics of the crime scene that you absolutely would take pictures of. I hope that people who are handling the investigation will consider whether perhaps it might be time to release some more of that information, so connections to other crimes in other places, or if someone had ever spoken to the perpetrator of this crime, perhaps it would give them a clue that they had learned something from the perpetrator. The public doesn't know some of these similar characteristics, and even then the characteristics they were looking for tended to be more general things than the items I'm talking about. And I'm not certain of the exact significance of these things, but they are very unusual.
First thing they speak about is Bill Stephenson's nephew, Stevie Stephenson, who was a person of interest earlier on. He killed a woman named Lee Jennings in Aurora, Indiana, with a skillet and a pepper mill. So that just sounds pretty crazy. And how the podcaster had thought that he was the one that had committed the crimes. And so Detective Cox, he described it as totally opposite from Bill and Peggy's crime scene. He described it as desperate and that it had lots of evidence left at the crime scene. He also said, which sounds very similar to Delphi, that they don't eliminate people, they vet them. Some of you may remember that Tope Lesenvey says that nobody's cleared, they're covered. And so that's one similarity.
Law enforcement has DNAs. Have investigators uploaded the profile into a database such as gedmatch.com, where people voluntarily submit their DNA? I asked this of Cox. The DNA is not suitable for genealogy or phenotyping at this time, he said. We hope in the future that changes. This could imply a few things, including that the DNA is from more than one person.
Detective Cox said that they vetted Steve Stephenson and they moved away from him fairly quickly. Then the podcaster asked if Bill and Peggy's death had anything to do with a robbery. And he says that he wouldn't necessarily say that, but he does stress a point very much so. He said, one thing is clear, that both Bill and Peggy had to die.
Of things that were changed and organized in this crime scene to give the appearance of motives, plural. So you could go so far down the path of the motive of robbery, but yet there were things in the crime scene of value that were left, and those things were items that you would typically see people take when they burglarize a home or rob someone or take something from the car, things that very quickly could either cash or could be turned into cash quickly without having serial numbers on them and those kinds of things. So a lot of those things were left at the scene, so you can only go so far down that. But The one thing, and the statement that I wanted to make to kind of set the stage for this case, the one thing that was very, very clear, and of course when you talk about murder, you say, well, what was the motive for murder? But here is the deal. And I don't want to say that murder was the motive, but I do want you to listen to what I'm saying. Bill and Peggy both had to die. This is a case that at the end of the day, when you go down all of those paths that I talked about, and then you kind of get to a dead end and you go, well, that's not the motive. The one thing that is obvious and apparent in this case is that both Bill and Peggy had to die. There were so many options that the killer or killers would have had the opportunity to do, and that is to kill if they were angry or they were retaliating against something or someone. They could have killed Bill by himself at any time. So the one thing that's really obvious is the killer or killers had one thing that had to be accomplished. Both Bill and Peggy had to die. So I know I stuck on that point for a long time, but the one thing that is really obvious in this case is that both Bill and Peggy had to die.
Oh, I found that really interesting. It seems like maybe part of the posing required two people, because just the way he stressed that point, Libby case, they always say like the two stuck together is a little bit similar to me. Goes on to say that it's difficult to figure out necessarily what the motive is, or because they don't actually have a crime scene. They have what the killer presented to them. So the killer in the Bill and Peggy Stephenson case spent hours afterwards and posed not only like the bodies and things around them, but also every single room in the house. It just sounds like a really weird crime scene. Like, he says that they gave the indication that like of people that they liked or people that they didn't like, and they stayed consistent throughout the house. So I have no idea what that means, but it's just very odd. Like, that is a super unique, weird case. And I think that in the early days in Delphi, a lot of rumors were that crime scene was very odd.
We do not have a crime scene, which makes this really complex. We have a scene where two murder victims were found, Bill and Peggy, but everything in that scene, every room had something that was altered in it and changed by the killer or killers, by the perpetrators. And so we have the scene that they wanted us to find, not the crime scene. So when I say that, you can just multiply that out. I mean, there were things that were moved around in the residence that would indicate someone's strong like for a certain individual. And then there might be an item in another room of that same person, and the same thing. There might be an indication of a strong like for that certain individual. Then on the other hand, in another room there could be a picture of another person, and there would be indications of a strong dislike for that individual. And if you found something that related to that person in another room, the thing would be consistent. In other words, if they didn't like something that related to someone in one room, the theme stayed the same throughout the house. Same is true if they disliked someone, or at least that's what they want us to think. So just little things like that to confuse. And I am being guarded. I'm not telling you what those things are or what those items are, but those are things that and would seemingly have nothing at all to do with why Bill and Peggy were murdered. It was just something done to confuse and to mislead.
Or maybe their message.
Or maybe their message, which as we have reached out publicly through the media to talk to the killer or killers, is like, you obviously have a message to tell us, and help us get the message that you're trying to communicate, because there were a lot of things in that scene that were changed, things that were on the peripheral, didn't have anything to do with the murders, but they're obviously there for a message of some kind.
And so he says that it's not a crime scene. You have the scene they wanted you to see. It was there to confuse, mislead, and that there was a message from things that were changed on the peripheral. About taking the case to VDOC, which is like some secret crime fighting society. Take cases, 12 cases a year, and like one a month. And one of the things that they wanted them to look into was due to like the symbolism and ritualistic aspect of the items placed around the victims. They looked into Wiccans in the area. It looked like they were trying to make it look like a ritualistic. Maybe it was just intended to mislead.
And then ritualistic.
Right.
Then they would go, hey, have you looked at this? Because you did this, you had this in your scene, and this is the way it was positioned around the body. And so we had a lot of suggestions, as it relates to whatever their background was to their field. So we did. We looked at a lot of those things, and we went and spoke with people in the area. I mean, we actually got a list, if you can understand this, of witches and Wiccans in the Kentucky area. She looked at it. She said, "Look, there's a lot of attempts at ritualistic, but none of this." She says, if somebody was trying to do it, they were experimenting. They've never done this before, because none of this is what you would say, oh yes, this is definitely a sacrificial ritual event as it relates to pagans. Or
Vida also said that they had probably talked to their killer.
That you have Vidak, who said the offender likely made disparaging comments about the victims or related family members immediately after the homicides when there were news stories. The comments at the time would have seemed odd to whoever heard them, and they would have no context within which to evaluate the comments. So, that if there's one or more perpetrators, I'm just a big believer that people talk. For the most part, people talk. And it's whether people listen or take it in or understand what they're hearing. So someone may have just been very mouthy, disparaging of Bill and Peggy, or, said, yeah, they got what they deserved. I mean, something like that. I thought that was a pretty interesting thing to come out of a representative from VDOT, because I'll be honest, I've never heard him comment on a case before.
Then the podcast host, she talks about how she had gotten a hold of Detective Cox on the anniversary, which was May 29th, and she says today is the day, which, I mean, just randomly, another coincidence. And there was also a post-mortem injury inflicted on one of the victims at least 2 hours later.
I believe that it was like something hit me, like, look at this case. And I picked it up and I'm like, well, today is the day. Obviously, there are many cases that are confusing, that are troubling, but everything I've read, everything you've done so far, quite frankly, is overwhelming to me. There's, weapons were brought and taken away. There was no weapon there. I can't tell for sure, but it doesn't look like or sound like there was a forced entry, or you don't even have to answer that. But it's, it was May, it was Memorial Day, maybe it was, windows were open, or, who knows. I'm sure Bill and Peggy, it's a lovely area. I mean, who would worry about leaving a window open, in this lovely development? It's this very homey family, kind of place. It's such an odd thing to have happened, so it doesn't at all seem random. It doesn't seem that the perpetrators are unknown to them. It seems that someone had to know. Because of you mentioned something, because of the scene being changed so much, it's really hard to say, I really believe this is someone that Bill and Peggy knew, and they may have known them very well. But the one thing that is really obvious, that's really convincing, is that the perpetrator or perpetrators seem to be very familiar with Bill and Peggy and the surroundings, the residents there, simply because, and we haven't mentioned it until this moment, but the perpetrators spent a lot of time in the residence after the murders. There was an injury to one of the victims that was post-mortem at least 2 hours post-mortem, and could have been even longer than that. We know, and obviously we're not going to give the exact time of the death, but we know the exact time of the death. And so what we've done in other statements with people that we have interviewed with the media is to state that it happened between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Right. And we actually have the exact time from a...
And so then they go on to say that Bill and Peggy would not have just let anyone random in, and that he did not invite like truckers or anything over to their house, and that the killer like, most likely was familiar with their house because he spent so much time there afterwards, rearranging stuff and also inflicting those post-mortem wounds on one of the victims, which also in the Delphi case there was rumors early on of possible, like, a letter being carved into one of the girls, and so that is another thing that I found similar about them. And then they also said that they know the exact time that they died because of one of them had a medical device that stopped when they died, so probably like a pacemaker or something. But they just say it happened between 1 and 4 a.m., which also could coincide with the Delphi cases because there was possible screams heard at like 2 a.m. And Doug Carter says like something about the complexities of the time about the case, which always struck me as weird. I actually have a video on that. It's really short. It's just like him saying that. So I'll try to link that into this video.
As far as the time frame and different things in my experience are unique to my career.
I can't think of anything else that they said that is particularly interesting. If I do, I'll just include it in right here. But there's just, those are all the things about this case that I found to be similar to like rumors in the Delphi case early on. And so thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. I hope you found this interesting and valuable.